Thank you, John. It's a pleasure for me to be here. But right now we're going to talk about numeric nutrient criteria, which was my old job. And maybe, if all goes well next week, this will be the last panel you'll have to endure on numeric nutrient criteria. You'll understand why I say that when I'm finished with my presentation. And there it is. All right, let's get into a little history so you have the background on numeric nutrient criteria. Many of you have lived this, so you can go to your BlackBerry during this slide if you need to. In 2009, essentially EPA settled a lawsuit with Earthjustice representing 5 various environmental groups in the state to set numeric nutrient criteria in the state of Florida. What this is numeric limits for nitrogen and phosphorus that can enter our waterways and continue to protect our waterways. Nitrogen, phosphorus being a natural element in the environment, so it's very tricky science. In 2010, EPA promulgated freshwater criteria for lakes, springs, streams in our state, and litigation ensued. I think the list of people that sued EPA over this is larger than the list that couldn't have sued. So there were a lot of people in that courtroom, and they'll be there again next week. The reason it was so controversial was the way that EPA constructed their criteria. And there's 2 main things that were problematic for our state that resulted in almost 10 times the costs that were estimated otherwise if you did it the way the state did it. One, we have restoration programs in place that were not recognized. So we had a double layer of EPA standards and state standards in many of our water bodies where we were working on restoration programs like the St. Johns River, like the Wekiva River, those types of places. That would have imposed additional cost. And the other thing is the streams criteria, which is where most of the effect is realized, did not acknowledge a stressor-response relationship. They didn't, and the state couldn't, all the scientists couldn't figure out at what level nitrogen and phosphorus actually caused harm. So they set criteria based on mimicking natural conditions, essentially. And so when that happened, there was a lot of litigation, and actually EPA stream criteria after litigation was remanded and found invalid. In the meantime, the department picked up the mantle. We petitioned EPA, said, please, we'll take care of this. We've got this one. And we started rulemaking, and we addressed both of those serious concerns. First of all, if you had that restoration program in place, continue. We're not going to add more criteria for that restoration program. And second, if your stream is biologically healthy and your river is biologically healthy, we're not going to impose costs. So we added more standards in there, more provisions in there to avoid those unnecessary costs and continue to protect the waterways. You still monitor biology. If it's unhealthy, if it has algae blooms, regardless of nutrient conditions, hey, we got to fix that. We got to ramp up the restoration program in those circumstances. So ours were very different than EPA's. And that was going to force a serious policy shift at EPA, which they did. In 2011, EPA did approve our rules, and we were very grateful. That was a very significant step for them. So we have approved rules for lakes and streams and springs. And they also approved a number of estuaries, and then even more estuaries in 2012. But EPA had a second deadline under the consent decree. In 2012, they had to propose estuaries and coastal waters, and they did that for the ones we hadn't set yet. We still wanted them to exit the state. We still had a petition out there that said, come on, we've got this. We're doing these criteria. So we started talking to them, and in March 2013, we crafted what we called a path forward with EPA, an agreement in principle that had us introducing state legislation, had us doing rulemaking in order for them to exit the state, which is happening right now. I have a second slide on the more details on that one. So Senate Bill 1808 was introduced. There was a House companion. It did pass the legislature. It was signed by the governor, and that pretty much set us on a path to have state-level criteria done the state way and not EPA criteria done the EPA way. Now, EPA, when they promulgated their estuary criteria, they based it on models, water quality models, and we use actual data from our streams, and there was a big difference, and not a very attractive difference either when you looked at EPA's proposals. So we were very motivated to get estuary criteria based on data in the state of Florida. Now, so 1808 passed, it's signed by the governor, and the next deadline is September 30th of this month, and that's when we would expect that EPA would approve what we submitted and all of our estuary criteria, and if the judge agrees, exit the state. I'll get into more of that later. So that's where we have nutrient criteria covered right now. That's daunting, that's a lot, but it's done the state way, and it's done in a manner that helps us navigate and only impose, take those restoration actions where they're needed. The other thing we can brag about is that we are way ahead of the rest of the nation. This shows how much criteria we have. The darker blue it is, the more we have. And this was done in an attempt to make sure that Florida takes its nutrient conditions very seriously. We are going to do the job the way we want to do it. So when you look at this and you compare it to those states that don't have even a hatch, you can see that we've been taking care of business. So what happened recently in July, so since 1808 passed, and since we have that new legislation, it directed a number of actions that the department was to undertake. And so we got busy. We adopted a bunch more estuaries. We adopted nutrient criteria for coastal waters based on working with local scientists, looking at the data, getting feedback, and adopting something appropriate. We sent it in for a number of estuaries, then the Panhandle estuaries, and we also submitted certain nutrient TMDLs. And EPA has been taking action to approve those over the summer. On August 1st, we submitted a report to the governor and legislature which interpreted some of the language in Senate Bill 1808 that essentially established criteria for the rest of our estuaries. So now, on August 1st, EPA has our complete package, the state's complete package for nutrient criteria, and in the department's opinion, they can act on that package and exit the state. The other thing, if there's any scientists in the room, you jump up in joy, and this is a very gleeful moment, but the dissolved oxygen criteria we've had in our state since the 70s and 80s is just wrong. And we falsely impair water bodies all across our state. But it's a tricky criteria, but the department did establish new DO criteria based on Florida science for all of our freshwaters and estuaries this year, and EPA just approved that. That's going to make a big difference for all those city managers and industries that have been plagued by that criteria. It's not as sexy as nutrient criteria, but boy, it just warms my heart. So next week, next Tuesday, that's a big day, they should charge admission, but the federal judge will hear oral arguments on whether EPA can exit the state. EPA has held up their part of the path forward. They've made motions to the court. They've changed their obligations through amended findings, and then petitioned the court to say, we're done. Once we approve these estuary criteria, we're done. Now, there are people that disagree that EPA should be done, so they are in the court at the same time, suggesting that EPA has more to do. But we've been talking with EPA. We filed an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, to say, no, we've got plenty of criteria. I mean, you saw the map. We're done. So, and then by September 30th, that consent decree deadline, that's when we expect EPA to approve our remaining estuaries and support their motion to the court to basically exit the consent decree. And then we'll be done. And you will have no more nutrient panels at the Water Forum. So, that's it. That's my contact information. John, I think I've done my piece.
Very good. Thank you, Drew.
I don't know if you heard his parting comment. He thought he did his piece. But he did way more than his speech, and I'd just like to thank him and have everybody thank him for the work that he and his staff have done with this whole criteria, very complicated criteria issue. So from us.